I hid in the back of a Korean Mafia boss's car to escape a man who wanted to sell my soul. I didn't know the stern-looking man in the tailored suit was the city's most dangerous dragon. I only knew that if the debt collector outside that window caught me, I'd never see another sunrise. As the locks clicked shut, he didn't hand me over. He just watched me with intense obsidian eyes and whispered, "You're in my world now, little bird." Welcome to the new dynasty. If the idea of fleeing a relentless predator only to be trapped in the cage of a calculated kingpin makes your blood run cold, hit that like button if your heart just stopped. Subscribe now and drop your location and time in the comments, because the moment I pulled that car handle, my life as a nobody ended forever. My red delivery cap was soaked with sweat, and my hand trembled against the door handle as Silas's hardened face pressed against the glass outside. I was just a delivery girl with a debt I didn't create. But in the next 10 seconds, I became the only thing Kang Dae-Hyun ever decided to keep. The black sedan glided away from the curb, leaving Silas's muffled rages and the chaotic parking lot behind as if they belonged to another dimension. Inside the car, the silence was thick, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the frantic thudding of my heart against my ribs. I pressed myself against the door, my fingers still clutching the handle I had tried to pull just moments before. Dae-Hyun sat beside me, his long, dark hair caught in the silver moonlight filtering through the tinted glass. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a storm at rest. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "Where are you taking me?" He didn't turn his head. His sharp, angular profile remained fixed on the road ahead, his intense eyes assessing the city as if he owned every street we crossed. "You sought sanctuary in a den, little bird," he said, his voice a controlled, low rumble that vibrated through the leather seat. "Now you must deal with the dragon." As we left the city center, the neon lights of the mall faded, replaced by the towering iron gates of an estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. Armed men in silent black suits stood at every corner, their eyes scanning the perimeter with a lethal focus that made Silas look like a playground bully. This wasn't just a rich man's house. This was the heart of an empire. The car stopped in a courtyard paved with dark stone. Dae-Hyun stepped out, his tall, authoritative presence instantly drawing every guard to attention. He didn't wait for me. He walked toward the massive oak doors of the penthouse with a polished, calculating stride that suggested he was used to being followed. I scrambled out of the car, my red delivery cap falling to the ground. I left it there. I followed him into a hall of marble and glass, where the walls were lined with monitors displaying every inch of the surrounding miles. There was no warmth here, only efficiency and power. As he turned to look at me, the sterile light of the penthouse caught the cold obsidian of his gaze. I realized then that I hadn't just escaped a debt collector. I had traded my life for a place in a world where the only thing more dangerous than the enemies at the gate was the man standing right in front of me. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken not by a voice, but by the cold blue light of a dozen monitors lining the wall. Dae-Hyun stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back, his tailored suit jacket discarded to reveal the holstered weapon resting against his ribs. I stayed near the edge of the room, feeling like a smudge of grease on a silk sheet in my stained work shirt. I was safe from the street, but I realized my old life was truly gone. "Look," Dae-Hyun commanded. I stepped forward, my eyes finding the center screen. It was a live feed from a news station outside of one of Dae-Hyun's downtown logistics hubs. Silas was there, his muscular frame looking even more intrusive in the bright daylight. He wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. He was standing in the middle of a crowd of reporters, holding up a crumpled piece of paper, the contract my father had signed. This man, Kang Dae-Hyun, is harboring a fugitive, Silas roared into a microphone, his face a mask of calculated righteousness. Zora Vance is legal collateral. She belongs to the Iron Lotus syndicate until her debt is paid. If Dae-Hyun doesn't hand over my property by midnight, every ship, every truck, and every warehouse under his name becomes a target. The air left my lungs. Silas was turning my private nightmare into a public declaration of war. He wasn't just coming for me anymore. He was using my existence as a legal hook to dismantle Dae-Hyun's empire. I felt a wave of nausea. To Silas, I wasn't a person. I was a debt to be claimed, a piece of property used to bait a dragon. Dae-Hyun didn't flinch. He watched the screen with an emotionless expression, his sharp jaw tight. He looked like a man assessing a minor nuisance rather than a threat to his life's work. He thinks he can use a delivery girl to breach my territory, Dae-Hyun whispered, his voice dangerously calm. He finally turned to me, his obsidian eyes scanning my terrified face. He calls you property. He thinks the law of the street gives him a claim to what is inside my walls. He stepped closer, his presence so dominant it seemed to shrink the massive room. Do you want to go back to him, Zora? Do you want to be the collateral that pays for your father's sins? No, I choked out, my voice barely audible. Then stay close, he said, his hand momentarily ghosting over my shoulder in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Silas made a mistake. He brought a debt to a war zone. Now he will learn that once the dragon locks the door, nothing leaves without my permission. The penthouse felt colder than usual as I stood in the center of the vast dressing room, my reflection caught in a dozen floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I looked like a glitch in the luxury around me, still dressed in the stained red polyester of my delivery uniform, the Pizza Planet logo on my chest, a mocking reminder of the life that had tried to kill me. I felt small, hunched over, trying to occupy as little space as possible, a habit born from years of trying to stay beneath the radar of predators like Silas. Dae-Hyun entered the room, his movements silent and predatory. He didn't look at the racks of designer silk or the display cases of gold. He looked only at me. In his hand, he carried a heavy silver lighter. "That uniform is the skin of a victim, Zora," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air I breathed. "It is the camouflage you use to tell the world you are disposable. You are a nobody so long as you wear it." He gestured to a stone basin in the center of the room. "Take it off. Burn the girl who runs. She doesn't exist in this house." My hands shook as I unbuttoned the cheap fabric. I felt exposed, the yellowing bruises on my skin feeling like brandings of my failure. But Dae-Hyun's gaze didn't hold pity. It held a dark, simmering challenge. I dropped the red shirt and the matching cap into the basin. He flicked the lighter, the flame dancing in his obsidian eyes, before he handed it to me. As the polyester caught fire, the smell of acrid smoke filled the room, a funeral pyre for the delivery girl. "Now," he whispered, turning toward a rack of clothes that shimmered like spilled oil. He pulled out a dress of deep midnight emerald silk, the fabric so heavy and rich it seemed to drink the light. "You have spent your life shrinking so you wouldn't be noticed. From this moment on, you will wear clothes that demand to be seen. You will take up space, or you will be crushed by it." As I slipped the silk over my head, the cool fabric felt like armor. It didn't hide me, it announced me. Standing there, watching the last of the red ash settle, I realized the transformation had begun. I was no longer a ghost in the machine of the city. I was becoming something sharp, something visible, and something dangerously close to the man who had claimed me. The emerald silk felt like a second skin, heavy and unapologetic as I sat across from Dae-Hyun in the private alcove of a high-end restaurant. This was a demand to be seen moment, just as he had promised. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and expensive wine, but beneath the luxury, the tension was a physical weight. Dae-Hyun watched me, his obsidian eyes tracking every breath I took, testing whether I would shrink back into the shadows or hold my ground in this new, glittering armor. The piece shattered with the sound of a brick through glass. A split second later, the front doors burst open. Silas didn't lead the charge. He was too smart for that. But his crew poured in, leather jackets and heavy boots clashing violently with the white linen of the dining room. Screams erupted, and the blurred figures of ordinary diners scrambled for exits, caught in a drama they weren't prepared for. Dae-Hyun didn't flinch. He stood slowly, his hand moving to the inside of his jacket with a lethal, practiced grace. But my eyes weren't on the gunman. They were on a young server, a girl no older than 19, frozen in the line of fire. She was clutching a silver tray, her eyes wide with the same invisible terror I had worn just days ago. One of Silas's men raised a shotgun, his focus on the server as he prepared to clear a path to our table. Something inside me snapped. The little bird who hid in the back seat was gone. I didn't think about the debt or the danger. I only saw a version of myself about to be extinguished. I lunged forward, the emerald silk rustling like a battle cry. I didn't have a weapon, but I had the weight of the heavy oak chair beside me. I shoved it with every ounce of the strength I'd gained from years of lifting delivery crates, catching the gunman's knees just as he pulled the trigger. The blast went wide, shattering a chandelier above us. Before he could recover, I grabbed the server's arm and yanked her behind the thick marble pillar of the alcove. "Stay down," I barked, my voice sounding foreign, steady, sharp, and commanding. A hand gripped my shoulder, but it wasn't an enemy. Dae-Hyun was standing over us, his weapon drawn, a strange, dark shadow of a smile playing on his lips as he looked down at me. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a victim he had to protect. He was looking at a partner who had joined the fight. "You took up space, Zora," he whispered over the sound of returning fire. The siege was far from over, but as I held the trembling server's hand, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting back.
The adrenaline from the restaurant siege had soured into a cold, heavy lump in my chest by the time we returned to the penthouse. Dae-Hyun remained silent, his presence a dark pillar of authority as he led me not to the living quarters, but to his private study. The room smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco, a sharp contrast to the gunpowder still clinging to my emerald silk. On the center of his mahogany desk lay a single, weathered folder. "You fought today because you believed you were protecting your life," Dae-Hyun said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "But you need to understand the nature of the chains Silas is pulling." He slid the folder toward me. My hands, still stained with the dust of the restaurant's shattered marble, shook as I opened it. Inside was the contract, the debt that had turned my life into a hunt. I expected to see a loan agreement or a gambling marker. Instead, I saw my father's sprawling, desperate signature at the bottom of a document titled Transfer of Future Equity. My eyes scanned the lines, my heart stuttering. It wasn't just money he had borrowed. To secure his mounting losses, my father had signed away my future earnings and physical agency to Silas's syndicate for a period of 10 years. I wasn't a debtor. I was a commodity that had been pre-sold to the Iron Lotus. Silas didn't want the money back. He wanted the property he had already paid for. The realization hit me harder than any of Silas's threats ever had. I felt a wave of profound nausea, a sense of being hollowed out. To the man who raised me, I was nothing more than a high-value asset to be traded away to settle a tab. I wasn't a daughter, I was a transaction. I looked down at the emerald dress, which only moments ago felt like armor, and suddenly it felt like a different kind of price tag. "I'm just an object to them," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "A piece of paper they can pass around until the ink fades." Dae-Hyun stepped into the light, his obsidian eyes fixed on the contract. "To Silas, yes, you are a tool to be used against me." He leaned over the desk, his face inches from mine, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective hiss. "But an object cannot choose to fight. An object cannot save a life in a hail of gunfire.
They see a ledger, Zora. I see a dragon in the making. He didn't take the paper away. He left it there, a raw reminder of my past, forcing me to decide if I would remain a line item in a gang's ledger or become the person who burned the book entirely. The air in the penthouse study felt thin, charged with the static of a storm that had finally broken. The contract, that cold, clinical map of my father's betrayal, still lay open on the mahogany desk. I stared at the ink, waiting to feel the weight of my chains, but Dae-Hyun was already moving. He didn't reach for a checkbook or a wire transfer. Instead, he reached for a heavy, matte black case beneath the table. "Silas wants to settle the account," Dae-Hyun said, his voice a low, melodic threat that made the hair on my arms stand up. "He believes that because a piece of paper says he owns you, I must negotiate for your return." He looked at me, his obsidian eyes reflecting the dim light of the room. "In my world, Zora, you do not negotiate for what is already yours. You simply eliminate the competition." He led me to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Below, the dark silhouettes of 3 black SUVs pulled into the courtyard. On the monitors, I saw Silas's top lieutenants, the men who had helped him hunt me through the mall, stepping out, their faces arrogant, expecting a payoff. They thought they were here for a transaction. They were wrong. Dae-Hyun didn't say a word. He didn't have to. As the men approached the entrance, a flash of silenced gunfire erupted from the shadows of the estate. It was over in seconds. There was no shouting, no prolonged struggle, just the clinical, efficient removal of the men who had spent years making me feel small. The debt wasn't being paid in currency. It was being erased in blood. I watched, my breath hitching as the figures on the screen fell. For the first time in my life, the fear that had been my constant shadow began to dissolve, replaced by a fierce, terrifying clarity. Silas's power over me died with his men. Dae-Hyun turned back to me, the light from the monitors casting sharp, angular shadows across his face. He picked up the silver lighter and held it out. "The lieutenants are gone. Silas is alone, and the contract is now written in a language he cannot read," he said, stepping into my space. "The door is unlocked, Zora. You are no longer collateral. You can walk out of those gates and never look back." I looked at the open door, then at the emerald silk on my skin, and finally at the man who had turned his world into a fortress for me. If I left, I would be the girl who ran. If I stayed, I would be the woman who ruled. I took the lighter from his hand, but I didn't walk toward the door. I walked toward the desk and set the corner of the contract on fire. As the paper curled into black ash, I looked up at him, my gaze steady and matching his own intense heat. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered. Dae-Hyun leaned in, his hand cupping the side of my face, his thumb tracing the jawline I was finally holding high. "Then let us show Silas what happens when the dragon's partner decides to take up space." The map glowing on the mahogany desk was no longer a symbol of my debt. It was now a tactical grid of a city I had memorized during 1,000 rain-slicked midnight shifts. Dae-Hyun stood over it, his brow furrowed as his commanders reported a total shutdown of the industrial district. Silas had played his final card, using his corrupt connections to leak a tip that triggered a massive police blockade, while his own gang filled the gaps with armed lookouts. They were trying to box the dragon in, cutting off the vital supply lines that kept Dae-Hyun's empire breathing. "The main arteries are dead," one of the lieutenants muttered, pointing to the red-marked zones on the screen. "There's no way to move the hardware without starting a war in the middle of the city." I stepped forward, my fingers tracing the digital streets with a confidence that surprised even me. "You're looking at the roads the city wants you to see," I said, my voice steady and clear. I tapped a series of grayed-out alleyways and service tunnels near the old garment district. "These aren't on your GPS. They don't have cameras, and the height clearance is too low for police cruisers, but my old delivery van could clear them by an inch." Dae-Hyun turned to me, his intense gaze shifting from the map to my face, silent and assessing. "When you're a delivery girl, you learn the city's veins," I explained, looking him directly in the eyes. I know every loading dock with a broken sensor and every one-way street that the patrol cars avoid because the asphalt is too shredded. If we split the fleet into 3-car cells and take the service entrance behind the old brewery, we can bypass the entire blockade in 15 minutes. A map of the city's hidden infrastructure began to form in my mind, a mental blueprint born from years of being invisible. "Do it," Dae-Hyun commanded, his voice a low, approving rumble. He didn't just give the order, he handed me a radio. "Zora leads the navigation. If she says turn, you turn. If she says stay in the shadows, you vanish." I felt the weight of the device in my hand, a tool of power instead of a pizza box. As we descended to the garage, I wasn't the girl hiding in the back seat anymore. I sat in the front of the lead vehicle, my eyes fixed on the rain-slicked concrete. With every turn I called out, we slipped through the city like a ghost, weaving through the blind spots I had discovered while everyone else was looking the other way. We were moving beneath the skin of the city, a dragon and his strategist, carving a path through a trap that was never meant for a girl who knew how to take up space. The rain turned the industrial docks into a landscape of jagged shadows and slick, oil-stained concrete. We had successfully bypassed the blockade, but Silas's desperation had made him reckless and lethal. A sudden, thunderous explosion at the front of the convoy forced our vehicles into a screeching halt. In the chaotic haze of smoke and flashing strobes, a secondary team of Silas's mercenaries swarmed from the shipping containers. I watched in horror from the lead SUV as Dae-Hyun stepped out, his weapon cleared and ready, a dark god of war amidst the fire. He moved with a precision that was beautiful and terrifying, but there were too many of them. Silas appeared from behind a crane, holding a detonator, his face twisted in a manic grin of triumph. "I don't want the girl anymore, Dae-Hyun," he screamed over the roar of the wind. "I want the dragon's head." A flashbang grenade detonated, whitewashing my vision. When the world blurred back into focus, the courtyard was empty of everything but the smell of burnt rubber and salt. Dae-Hyun was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, trapped bird, but the panic didn't paralyze me. I knew exactly where they had taken him. The main warehouse at Pier 17 was a notorious kill box, a massive, windowless structure with only one visible entrance that Silas would have rigged with every sensor and gunman he had left. But I remembered a summer 3 years ago, delivering cold sodas to the dock workers during a strike. There was an old, rusted conveyor chute behind the desalination tanks, hidden by years of overgrown weeds and discarded pallets. It was a narrow, claustrophobic crawl space that led directly into the rafters of the main floor. I grabbed a tactical radio and a heavy wrench from the floor of the SUV. I didn't wait for the reinforcements that were still blocks away. I ran through the downpour, my emerald silk dress soaked and heavy, sticking to my skin like armor. I found the desalination tanks, the salt air stinging my eyes. The chute was there, a dark, narrow throat of rusted iron. I squeezed inside, the metal scraping against my shoulders. It was a space meant to be invisible, a route for someone the world chose not to see. As I crawled through the darkness, the sounds of Silas's voice began to echo through the vents, boastful, cruel, and unaware that the little bird he had hunted was currently hovering directly above his head. I looked down through the rusted slats of the ceiling and saw Dae-Hyun strapped to a chair, blood trickling down his sharp jawline, but his eyes were still obsidian fire. He wasn't looking at Silas, he was looking up, searching for the shadow he knew would be there. I peered through the rusted slats of the ceiling, my heart a steady, lethal drum in the silence of the rafters. Below, Silas paced like a caged animal, his manic grin illuminated by the harsh overhead lights as he stood over a bound and bloodied Dae-Hyun. Silas was so consumed by his own pay triumph that he didn't notice the subtle shift in the shadows above him. I didn't reach for a gun. I reached for the warehouse's central control panel, a rusted console I had seen dockworkers use 100 times. With a sharp, decisive pull of the emergency release lever, I didn't just open a door, I unleashed a trap. The massive, overhead, heavy-load cranes, rigged to the very ceiling I stood upon, groaned to life. As the high-pitched whine of the motors filled the warehouse, Silas looked up, his face contorting from arrogance to pure, unadulterated terror. I sent a massive shipping crate swinging through the air, the sheer momentum of the steel box acting as a silent executioner. It didn't hit Silas, but it shattered the platform he stood on, pinning him beneath a mountain of debris and leaving him helpless as the sounds of Dae-Hyun's reinforcements finally breached the perimeter. I descended from the rafters, my emerald silk torn and stained, but my head held higher than it had ever been. I walked past the screaming Silas without a glance, my focus entirely on the man in the chair. I sliced through Dae-Hyun's restraints with a steady hand, and as he stood, he didn't reach for his weapon, he reached for me. "You didn't just take up space, Zora," he whispered, his obsidian eyes burning with a new, profound respect as he wiped a smear of blood from his jaw. "You conquered it." In the center of the ruined warehouse, amidst the dust and the echoes of a fallen enemy, Dae-Hyun took my hand. He pulled a heavy, silver signet ring from his own finger, a dragon coiled around a dark stone, and pressed it into my palm. It was a symbol of his bloodline, his empire, and his absolute protection. As I slid the ring onto my finger, the weight of it felt like a promise. I was no longer the delivery girl fleeing a debt. I was the strategist who had saved the dragon. I was the new order. Together, we walked out into the rain, not as master and captive, but as equals, ready to rule the city that had once tried to swallow me whole.
The shadows of the warehouse were long, but for the first time, I didn't fear what lived in the dark. My life as a nobody was buried under the rubble of Silas's greed. Standing beside Dae-Hyun, I wasn't just a survivor, I was a queen protected by the blood of the dragon. If you loved Zora's journey from a terrified delivery girl to the strategist of an empire, then you know what the assignment is. Smash that like button to honor a queen. Hit subscribe and join the inner circle because we're just beginning to tell the stories that will break your heart and put it back together again. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you found yourself trapped behind the locked doors of a mafia boss?